Perfect. It's a gateway drug into rocks. We might lead this episode off with that soundbite. I have a hunch.
Welcome to the Exploring Washington State podcast. Here's your host, Scott Cowan.
All right. In this episode, we're going to have a conversation with Leslie Moclock and Jacob Selander. They are the authors of Rocks, Minerals, and Geology of the Pacific Northwest. This conversation is going to rock. We talk about their book. We talk about the geology of Washington State and kind of how all those rocks that we see everywhere kind of got here and their formation. And we're going to crunch a few billion years of history into about a 60-minute episode. So get ready, listen and learn. This one's informative. This book looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. If you're into rocks, their book just released. You should pick it up and take a look at it. And if you haven't already, kind of follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, follow us on iTunes, all those places you can find Explore Washington State. We'd love to have you along for the ride. And let's get started. All right. Welcome, Leslie and Jacob. I appreciate both of you guys being here today. But I'm going to pass the baton and ask you to tell us about your book and how you guys got started in this, because I'd butcher it if I got started. How's that?
Well, we're, very glad to be on the podcast today. And it all started when I, for about 5 years, was the curator at the Rice Northwest Museum of Rocks and Minerals in Oregon. Don't tell anyone. And
it's a short drive from Washington.
It's true. And I was sitting at my desk one day and got an email from someone at Timber Press, our current publisher, soliciting for new authors. They wanted to expand into sort of the geology aspects of natural history, and asked if I was interested in writing a proposal to write a book. And my first instinct was, hell yeah, this is the perfect excuse to finally get to go travel around the region and go see and photograph all of the cool things I've wanted to go visit for, years now. And it could even be a tax write-off. So I kind of jumped on that chance, but I knew the idea of taking on a book about the geology of the region was going to be a huge project, and that I would definitely need a buddy to do it with me. And so I called up Jacob. We went to school together in grad school, which is how we knew each other. And he teaches in Washington State, and was basically like, yo, do you want to go on lots of cool geology adventures and write a book about it with me? And fortunately, he said yes.
Where did you guys go to grad school at?
University of California, Davis.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Jacob's originally from Oregon, and I'm originally from the East Coast, but the Northwest is really where it's at. So we're glad we ended up there.
All right.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back in the Northwest for sure.
So Jacob, she roped you into traveling around and doing this.
Didn't really take too much convincing.
Okay.
All right. Like Leslie said, it was a great excuse to just explore all parts of the region that I just hadn't explored before. I mean, even growing up in Oregon, we really didn't spend a whole lot of time east of the Cascades. And it turns out like a lot of the really, really cool geologic stories are east of the Cascades.
And
well, I grew up on the west side of Washington State, and I'm with you. I went to school in Ellensburg in the center of the state, but really that's about as far east as I ever went. And it's very different in Eastern Oregon and Washington than it is in Western Oregon and Washington. Absolutely. It's like, I don't know, outer space in a couple of spots, like Banks Lake area to me is very surreal looking. So, okay. On with your story. I interrupted.
No, that's fine. So that's kind of how we got started. And in a lot of ways, one of the things you asked me earlier was, who is this book for? And the answer is, it's for anyone who's ever looked at a rock and picked it up and wondered anything about it. What is it? Where is it from? Why is it here? But it's also written a little bit for myself when I first got to the Northwest, and wanting a book like this to exist. There are so many books about the geology of the Northwest. They're all fantastic. And I'm sort of humbled to be able to add a title to that very long and excellent list. But there are a lot of books about the stories of geology in the Pacific Northwest, but it's kind of hard to find out where you can go or how to go about finding the places where you can see those stories. And so a lot of this book is about how to recognize geologic objects in the landscape around you, and how to read those things in the space where you are, and also to get an idea of where in the state you can go if you're interested in a particular feature. It's not the kind of book where like it'll tell you, take Highway 97, turn left, go up this road, and like there's an outcrop and look at the specific thing. But if you're in a particular area of the state and you want to know more, you want to get familiar, you can start to dial yourself in or plug yourself into the local features around you and the local story around you. And that was a main goal for me in working on this book. I don't know if you have anything related to add, Jacob?
Well, yeah, kind of on another selfish-ish reason. Like I said, even growing up in Oregon and doing my undergraduate in Oregon, I'm sure I had this at points during my education, but again, undergraduate, I don't really recall a whole lot from parts of that. But it's just nice to be able to take a region like the one that you grew up in, and then just have the chance to synthesize its entire geologic history, and then take all of that and try to figure out, okay, how are we going to take this, billion plus years of history and summarize it so anybody can pick it up and anybody can understand it, and people can go, like Leslie was saying, find the stories in the rocks and know where to find it. And I think it's cool just to have all that knowledge, I guess, back in the front of my brain after initially learning it and then having to do all the research again.
Yeah. And speaking as a former East Coaster, one of the reasons that I found the Northwest so compelling when I first saw it is that it's an active geological area. It's a place of what are called active tectonics. Things are still happening. Growing up on the East Coast, which is what's called a passive margin, the last exciting things that happened there happened 200 million years ago. And so there's a lot of very old rocks, and you can kind of kick them and look at them, and somebody tells you, well, this indicates that there was like a cool volcano and this and that 200 million years ago. And you would look at all these diagrams. I would look at all these diagrams in my textbooks and sort of learn it in an academic sense and be like, yes, this means this and this means that. And then I came out to the West Coast, and it was like seeing my textbook, as cliche as it sounds, come to life. Like you see the line of volcanoes, you see, the dynamic coastline, you see the carved, the channeled scablands. You just, like all of these things that were totally sort of intellectual and something to memorize on a page were like, this is the laboratory of real life. This is real. Here it is right in front of you, thousands of feet tall. And that just absolutely took my breath away. And really, really captured and captivated me. And so that the process of reading those stories in real life as opposed to on a paper is something that people who live in Washington and Oregon really have the privilege of being able to do. So it's a unique and really special place to be able to explore this kind of material. Yeah,
to kind of piggyback on what you're saying there, Leslie, some of the youngest rocks in the Northeast, as you're saying, around 200 million years old. And if you think back to what the Pacific Northwest was 200 million years ago, you're just looking at an ocean.
Yeah, there were
very, very little of the Northwest actually existed during that time.
Okay.
Or at least existed in its current state.
It was all underwater.
Yeah.
It was waiting to get squished up onto land.
Yeah.
All right. How long did it take you guys to do all your research? How long has this process been to put this book from
It's been a 3 year
first conversation to today?
About 3 years.
About 3 years, yeah.
About 3 years. Okay.
About a year it was about 18 months of field work and writing, and then some number of months of editing, and then there was the sort of post-editing publishing process and stuff. And so yeah, it's a good chunk of time.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the good news is rocks are kind of they take a while, so you've got a little bit of time.
So not much not a whole lot has changed since we started the process.
That's true.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk about let's talk about Washington State.
Mm-hmm.
And before I hit record, we're talking about a couple of places. But Jacob, I'm going to ask you, put you on the spot.
Sure.
What are some notable things in Washington State you think people should know about that they might not be super aware of?
Oh man, I was actually just kind of thinking about this the other day because I'm just finishing up teaching actually a geology of the Pacific Northwest class this quarter.
Okay.
And putting together a bunch of virtual field trips. I found myself, I keep going back to locations along Highway 20 across the northern part of the state between Anacortes and Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that almost the entire history of the Northwest can be seen in outcrops along Highway 20. Like in outcrops, even from starting in the San Juan Islands, pieces of the uppermost mantle and lower crust that have been thrust up onto the continent. And then as you pass into the North Cascades, you get into rocks that formed at 20 some miles depth that are now at the surface. And then so driving up and over the passes, you're looking at modern volcanoes that have erupted in the last couple thousand years. And you pass into the eastern side of the state on the same road, and you go through a completely different kind of geologic environment that was dominated by lots of extension instead of the tectonic compression that's going on right now.
For those of us that don't understand what you just said, extension. What can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So if we think of the kind of the broad geologic setting of the Northwest and Washington right now, it's dominated by compression because just offshore we have the Juan de Fuca plate that is colliding with North America, and so they're both being forced towards each other. So we kind of have this dance of tectonic collision where you have two giant pieces of the Earth's crust colliding with each other. And the Juan de Fuca plate is the oceanic one, and its composition is a little bit denser than North America. So it gets shoved underneath and then induces a whole bunch of other processes that really manifest themselves best as the Cascades volcanoes.
Okay.
That's kind of a general description of compression. And of course, extension is the exact opposite, where instead of two pieces of the crust are being shoved towards each other, they're actually being pulled apart. And in this case, when Eastern Washington was being pulled apart, I'm trying to think that there's a one set hypothesis that's accepted for why, because there's a few different things. But one hypothesis is that if you put a bunch of really warm, buoyant material underneath the crust, it will push the crust up due to buoyant forces. Then as you push something up, you start to break it apart at the surface and extend it.
Okay.
So there's a period of time when Eastern Washington was undergoing extension prior to modern compression and after older compression.
So I'm going to interrupt and go back to sort of the beginning of what Jacob was just talking about, this idea that you can see the history of Washington driving along a highway. Because a lot of people, when they think of geology, they think, okay, you got to be like a rugged mountain man. You got to go, climb to the top of the highest peak, or you got to, scale a rock wall or something. But interestingly, some of the very, very best places to see rocks in any place are actually along the sides of roads and road cuts, because in the western part of the state, obviously it's very green, lots of beautiful plants, foliage, moss, all growing all over the rocks, so you cannot see them at all. And humans and our industriousness have carved big roads through mountains, which requires essentially blasting and scraping away at these hillsides and exposing rocks over the past few decades or a couple hundred years. So there is a lot more stuff that's fresh and exposed to see. So it's not an uncommon sight if you're ever driving along the highway and you see a van parked by the side of the road with some 20-something people all kind of crammed up against the rocks on the side of the road. You've just passed a geology trip, because those are great places to see fresh rocks and big rock relationships on these walls that have been carved out of the mountains. So looking at geology doesn't require you to be a super outdoorsy athletic person. You can actually do a lot of it from a car, although you can be outdoorsy and athletic if you want to. And I know we're talking about our book, but if that's something that you're interested in, there's a really great series of books called the Roadside Geology series. And that book is dedicated to that premise, what am I driving by and what can I see if I get out of my car and check this out? And we actually definitely used that as a resource when we were driving around looking for things to photograph for our book, because looking at things on the side of the road is a great place to get fresh-faced rocks, basically, which is something a lot of people don't expect.
Yeah, it's really true. Sometimes to get to the best rocks, you have to walk 20 feet from your car.
I don't know if I can do that. Well, so so Jacob, Highway 20, and you think it's a great cross section maybe of Washington State's geological history.
I do, in every sense of the term cross section.
Now that Jacob's claimed Highway 20, Leslie, what were you going to recommend?
I mean, Highway 20 is a pretty good one. Wait, sorry, what was the original question?
What's something interesting that our audience should hear about that they may be uncommon to them?
There is a geological story that is pretty well known, again, in the world of geology, but may not be quite so familiar to people who are new to geology, which is an episode in history called the Missoula floods or the Bretz floods. And they're responsible for a lot of the landscape that you get in eastern Washington, an area that's very evocatively called the Channeled Scablands. And there are a lot of really big and remote features, like Palouse Falls and Dry Falls. And Jacob, I'm sure you can name a bunch of other ones because you're more of the geomorphology guy. But it's such a big, it's seeing things on a big but understandable scale. Sometimes very often geologists are guilty of talking about things that are so big that we call it arm waving. You're like, and this was big, and that was bigger, and you're talking about things on the scale of 100 miles long and deep down in the crust, and it just kind of loses all, you lose your place in it all. It just seems too out there. But a lot of the stuff with the Missoula floods and scablands are things that are like really big and impressive, but you can stand in front of it and kind of see the whole thing and be like, wow, that's really cool. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, actually, Jacob, I'll maybe turn it over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about the story of the floods?
I'll kind of expand on what you were saying a little bit too, in terms of like the scale of things that you can observe, because a lot of people are familiar with, say, going to a stream and seeing little ripples in the sand at the base of a stream, and then with the Missoula floods, you could walk around these giant gorges and be wandering around like these hills that are all fairly linear and parallel, and you don't even recognize what they are until you're up on top of the gorge looking down, and then you realize those are ripples in sand and sediment produced by water. Those are the same sort of things that I saw in that tiny little stream the other day.
But they're 100 feet tall.
But they're huge. So I guess kind of the short Missoula flood story is during the last glacial maximum around 14,000 years ago.
The last ice age, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I was thinking that is LGM, but Leslie kind of has that taken. But during the last ice age, most of northern North America was covered in a giant continental ice sheet. And parts of that ice sheet had these little fingers or lobes that extended south, because ice sheets don't grow as an expanding pancake. They actually take advantage of lower spots in the topography and can grow basically like glacial lobes or fingers that extend out from the edge of the ice sheet. And one of these large fingers from the ice sheet in North America extended south into Montana, kind of northern Idaho and Montana, and dammed what is today the Clark Fork River. And in the process of damming that river, it created a giant temporary lake behind it. It's called Glacial Lake Missoula. And actually, if you're in Missoula, Montana, you can look up at the hills above the university there, and you can see shorelines of this lake. Okay. When it existed, there's basically a bunch of parallel stripes in the hillside. And one of the ways to get, they're basically bathtub rings all around the valley for this giant lake. Okay. And over time, it's kind of debated on the exact process by which this happened, but the ice dam broke, and which released hundreds of cubic miles of water down the Clark Fork Valley in a matter of days. And this water rushed through Montana, through Idaho, got dammed up again in Washington, kind of near Spokane, by another lobe of this ice sheet. And then eventually that broke through, and this huge volume of water rushed across most of the Columbia Basin in eastern Washington. And that's what, kind of where it gets the name channeled scablands, because you have this huge volume of water flowing at incredibly rapid speeds across the landscape. And it does a huge amount of erosional work in terms of tearing up rocks from underneath and creating these big vortices and potholes and carving waterfalls. And then eventually all this water went out through the Columbia River Gorge into the Willamette Valley and out into the Pacific Ocean. And this happened. I forget the exact number, but it's somewhere around 40 or 50 times.
Oh,
that this process. So
this wasn't a one-time event.
It was not a one-time event.
Oh, okay. When I've heard of this, I just assumed that it was one massive event, a one-time thing.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the fun, I guess, lesser known facts about Washington geology, yeah. Is that the Missoula floods are basically repeat offenders in carving out the scablands.
So how long of a period of time are we speculating this lasted? I mean, if we did it 40 or 50 times, was
It was over a period of, I think, 3,000 to 5,000 years.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, the like Jacob said, there's still debate on exactly how the ice dam formed and broke, but essentially you kind of have conditions that allow the building up of glacial Lake Missoula to repeat itself. You have this lobe that kind of creates a dam and the formation of a lake, and then the dam fails and everything rushes out, but it's still, really cold, and there's still a glacier, and the glacier builds back out and creates that dam again, so the lake fills up again, and then the dam fails again, and all the water rushes back out. And so the water, from what I understand, mostly followed similar paths each time, but you definitely have areas that are sort of more carved than others. And you can sort of see different episodes in different areas. So looking at specific features from the floods, things people may not be super familiar with. If you look at pictures of some of the big waterfalls in the Columbia Basin in eastern Washington, the waterfall looks very tiny compared to the ledge that it's coming off of. And what you have to realize is that the reason that the ledge was so big was because during these floods, that's how wide the waterfall was. And now the little rivers that are left behind are like dinky nothings compared to, the like kilometer wide waterfall that used to be there. But that's part of why we have this, that's part of what makes the landscape so austere and striking, is because of the amount that was scoured. And then these just little comparative trickles of water that remain in the pathways that were carved by these huge floods.
So this is kind of overwhelming to me, and that's okay, in a good way, in a good way.
Sure.
And while you guys are talking, I'm listening, but I'm also flipping through pages of your book, and I have lots of questions.
Ask away.
But before I start asking questions, though, put you guys on the spot during your research. Mm-hmm. And Leslie, you'll go first this time. Jacob, remember the question.
Do my best.
Because honestly, when she asked, I had forgotten what I asked you. So let's just total disclosure there. All right. So Leslie, you get to pick one spot in Washington State. Okay. Where is the coolest spot that you, from a geological standpoint, what's one spot?
That's not even a fair question. There is no.
I know. I make up the rules. It's okay.
There is no spot in Washington that is not cool geologically. That's the problem.
Okay. Well, that's lack of an answer is not an answer. We get to put you on the spot.
Coolest spot
to you. What's the spot that you think is like really cool?
So this is one of the things that I was sort of mentioning earlier, is the idea that for me, the enjoyment of geology is both an enjoyment of sort of the scientific history and what volcanic eruption caused that rock to be there and where did this basin come from, but also the way that geology gets wrapped up in human history and the particular people you kind of encounter along the way. So when I think about favorite geology or sort of a favorite spot, a lot of it for me is related to the specific part of the reason I wanted to do this book, right, was to go out and see these things and experience these things. And so a lot of my fondness for certain areas comes from the particular experiences I had when going out to see them. So I guess this is probably as good a time as any to bring up Liberty, which is famous for being where Liberty gold comes from, the wire gold. And also, if anyone is familiar with the Ellensburg blue agates, which are found further south of Liberty, but probably were originally from some of the basalts that are from the Liberty area. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about sort of that Highway 97 corridor, sort of the Ellensburg to Wenatchee kind of area. And If you're ever up that way, probably the first place you should stop is a coffee hut that is turquoise blue called Liberty Latte. Have you ever been in there?
I drive by it a lot. I do not think it's open anymore.
Oh, really?
Oh.
That's so sad. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
That's not 100%, 100%, but
if the hut's,
it's looking pretty vacant right now.
that's too bad. Okay. Well, last time I was there, maybe the hut's still there. It's still lovely and blue and turquoise.
Yes, it is. The hut, the building's
Okay.
there.
Well, you can stop in the parking lot, and across the street is a big road cut, kind of like I was mentioning at the beginning. So if it were still open, you could get a coffee and look at some rocks. But if it's not open, you'll have to bring.
Now you're talking. That works for me.
You'll have to bring your own coffee. The rocks that are across the street are mostly sedimentary rocks. So they started out as sand and mud and other sediments, basically, that were in the bottom of a valley or a basin. But they are what's called intruded by basalt. So basically that means that basaltic magma underground rose through the earth and erupted on the surface to be a basaltic lava flow. But, it had to get from under to above, right? So it had to kind of break its own network through to the surface. And what it left behind is something called a dike of basalt. So basically it's a place where this eruption came up through the ground and was lava sort of trying to reach the surface and intruded through these sediments. And you can see the dike and you can see the sediments. And also because during eruptions and things, there are a lot of fluids with sort of weird chemistries floating around. There are some pockets in the rocks around there where you can see not necessarily super rare minerals, but like more unusual minerals. There's a pocket of these minerals called zeolites that are really well crystallized that I saw the last time I was there. So it's a little story. It's not even really like a particularly unusual or interesting story in the scale of Washington. It's something that it's the kind of story you can see in a lot of places, but it's a good, easy place to go now, sadly, sans coffee. But part of the other reason that that place stands out so much in my mind is that it was the first place I went when I was trying to meet up with a guy named Rob Reppin. Has he been, I know you talked to Nick. Have you talked to Rob at all before?
No, I have not. No.
So Rob is a gold miner, and that's his full-time job. He's a gold miner, and he works for himself. He runs his own gold mine in the gravels around Liberty. So he's not in Liberty, the ghost town, which is kind of an interesting place to go visit, the gold mining ghost town. But he actually digs into the alluvial sediments for placer gold in the area. And when I was first starting one of the very first research trips I took for this book was to this area, the sort of Highway 97 area in Washington. And I was told by somebody, I can't even remember who, if you're up that way, you should look up Rob. You should look up Rob Reppin. And I was like, okay, who's this guy? And he's like, he's a gold miner. You should just go up to his mine and see if he's around, and he'll talk to you about his gold. And I was very skeptical, because if you've ever spent any time around any kind of miner, you know that they tend to be pretty territorial,
protective.
It's very, very common for people who have mine workings, to bring people along to show people around a mine, but only if they know the person, if they've been introduced, if they've previously made contact. And so this person who was just encouraging me to like go and find this random gold miner at his gold mine and say, hey, do you want to talk to me? I was like, okay, I should be wearing a bulletproof vest for this interview. But they, they were like, oh, no, you just show up. He'll be very happy to see you. And I was like intrigued, but incredibly skeptical. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to him was because when I was working at the museum, I was trying to do some research specifically on the Liberty Gold that we had in our collection. And he was, in theory, a person who could answer some questions about some of the specimens we had. And so I was like, okay, I really got to go talk to this guy, but like, I don't want to die. And so I stopped at the Liberty Latte area, one, because it was a road cut that I wanted to look at, but two, I figured in the area like that I could ask the person who worked there if she knew this guy and what the lay of the land was, so to speak. And I wish I'd asked her name, I don't remember, but she kind of gave me more specific directions to his place and gave me assurances that I wouldn't be met with a sawed-off shotgun. And I did in fact go meet Rob and have a great conversation with him, and he gave me a tour of his mine. And I got to, he actually went so far as to help me find the site of the historic Liberty mine that was the source of the wires that we'd had in our museum collection. And it was a place that I had tried to find myself previously and gotten like super, super duper lost, completely unable to find before. So it ended up being a very fun and fruitful visit. And we got to talk about, forestry policies and look at rocks and mining equipment. And it was all kinds of a good time. So in addition to being interesting from a scientific standpoint, it was fun from a personal standpoint as well. Rob was a really good guy.
All right, Jacob, top that. What do you got?
I can't. I can't.
That's a great story.
Yeah. I mean, I can't possibly come even anywhere close to that.
Well, you're going to have to, though. You gotta. So what's your favorite spot in Washington for this?
Oh man.
So Jake, I should mention
a tough question.
that Jacob is a brilliant photographer. He did quite a lot of the photography for the book. We both did. I took a lot of like studio pictures of rocks, but one of the reasons I called Jacob up in the first place, because I was like, dude, you got to take the pictures. So I don't know if there are any particular like photography stories or photography places that you enjoyed a lot.
Yeah, let's change your question to from a photography standpoint. Where's the spot that inspires you? How's that?
Okay. This I can't answer.
Awesome.
There are a few lesser known places in Mount Rainier National Park that aren't necessarily the easiest to get to, but once you're there, they are incredibly beautiful. I think one of my favorite spots that I've hiked back there 2 or 3 times just because it's that great. Is to start at the White River Campground and just keep hiking up the valley. You go along the trail. I forget the name of the backcountry campsite you get to after a few miles, but if you keep hiking up, I think it's towards the interglacier area. Not only is it just like you get above tree line, you're in this beautiful glacially carved valley, but you get to some rocks and this one outcrop and the space around it within about, I'd say 100 to 200 square meters records almost the entire history of Mount Rainier.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of hard to get to, but it's just like in terms of wanting to photograph stuff from a geologic perspective and just from a really pretty landscape perspective, it's hard to leave.
Okay.
But there's a set of much older erupted lavas from Mount Rainier. I don't know the names of the ages of any of these particular rocks because it's a tiny little outcrop. But there's a set of older rocks that erupted from Mount Rainier at some time in the past, solidified, and then were intruded into by another set of magma that was a completely different composition. And that magma solidified before erupting. So you have kind of this really nice juxtaposition between rocks that solidified at the Earth's surface, so they have really tiny microscopic crystals in them, and then rocks that solidified before erupting, so the crystals are macroscopic.
Really big.
Meaning you can actually get your face on the outcrop and look at individual crystals and get out a little ruler and measure their size if you really wanted to. Okay. And you can see right at the contact between the new intrusive stuff and the older volcanic stuff that there's a distinct gradient in the size of the crystals in the intrusive stuff where they were in first contact with the colder outside rock. They crystallized faster, so the crystals are a little bit smaller, and they slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger as you move away from that contact. But then this particular outcrop gets even better because it's covered in glacial striations. So when this valley was last occupied by a glacier, glaciers, we kind of jokingly call them nature's bulldozer because they do such a great job of just like picking up material and moving it from point A to point B without much effort. But at the base of a glacier, what happens is all the rocks that it's eroding get frozen into the ice at the bottom of a glacier and basically dragged like really, really coarse grit sandpaper across the underlying bedrock. And what's left behind is all these parallel grooves or striations in the rock. So that this one outcrop not only has this history of volcanic eruption and then intrusion and a cool cooling history, the whole thing is covered with glacial striations.
So basically what you're seeing is that this one square little patch of earth, you're seeing that the processes that created and affected it started out deep underground, like several kilometers underground. And they've gone all the way up to today where the things you're seeing the superficial forces that are shaping the way it looks. So you're seeing a long history of dynamic geologic events overlapping onto one another to create this one section of rock that's right in front of your face.
Yeah, I didn't. There's not a whole lot of people that go there. It's one of the I think the northeast side, one of the climbing routes from Mount Rainier.
Didn't you see a marmot when you were there one time though?
Yeah, I was actually about to get to that marmot.
Oh, we have a marmot story. All right.
Yeah, it's not as cool as a gold miner story, but this is, I think, the laziest marmot or the smartest marmot I've ever seen, because it was a pretty warm day, but there's still some snow patches around, and this marmot just like crawls out from behind a rock nearby me, and then crawls up over onto the snow patch and just belly flops down. And he's just laying there on this snow patch, watching me as I'm wandering around taking pictures of these rocks, and the marmot's just hanging out there, probably wondering what I was doing. It's like,
just totally unconcerned. Just
totally not concerned. It's like, okay,
hanging out.
Just, like, you are obviously very well fed for being this far away from people.
Smart marmot.
So as I'm flipping through here, I landed on page 170.
Okay.
And that's Mount St. Helens. In case you're not following along in your books at home. Just kidding.
I have mine in the other room.
Okay. So that's maybe the biggest event of our lifetimes, right? I mean, the eruption of Mount St. Helens locally?
Yeah, maybe you would say the biggest event that people recently have lived through in sort of a violent geologic event sense. Sure.
So have you guys climbed around up in there? What's that like to see something so fresh versus the stuff at Mount Rainier that's been there for, thousands and maybe millions of years even? What's your thoughts on the Mount St. Helens area? Oh,
I mean, it's fantastic. I've been
spectacular.
Been fortunate to get to summit the volcano from the south side, and go. I mean, looking at anything at Mount St. Helens is amazing from any place that you're at. But if you ever have the chance to actually climb up to the top of the mountain and look down at the caldera and the eruption field, it's phenomenally cool. So if you are a hiker type person, definitely put that one on your list.
I think I did that. I think that was one of the things that piqued my interest in geology, because I did that hike after finishing high school. And then I just remember being up at the south rim of the crater and just how active it was on the inside.
Yeah.
There's this constant low hum of rockfall inside the crater. And you're just sitting up there going like, wow, this was a much larger mountain less than 20 years ago. And now I'm sitting on the edge of this crater and it's still collapsing on itself.
It's not done.
So it's not done yet, is it? It's still it's still collapsing. Okay.
So it's
collapsing and growing at the same time.
Please elaborate.
Okay. So after the main large the huge eruption in 1980, there's a series of smaller dome building eruptions that took place inside the crater, where basically other really, really kind of sticky, almost consistency of peanut butter melt was erupting and formed a lava dome inside the crater. And kind of the last major eruption that was eruptions building that dome happened, I think just about, was it 2005? I think we're just approaching 15, 16 years ago.
Okay.
For those. And so basically after the major eruption, you still have the collapse of all the loose material inside the crater that's taking place. But simultaneously, the new dome is growing inside that crater as well. So if we give that another, say, 40 to 100 or 200,000 years, that lava dome has the potential to grow Mount St. Helens back to what it was previously.
Okay. I don't remember this, and nothing either of you may know either. So this one you don't have to answer if you don't know. But how much elevation did the mountain lose when it erupted?
It's currently like 8,200 feet, and I believe it was like 10,500.
Yeah, it was somewhere in the low tens before it.
So 20%.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's quite a bit. Quite a bit off the top.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you look at photos of the mountain immediately after the 1980 eruption, and you look at the crater compared to the crater today, you can actually see it's like very visibly grown. The crater in the middle is very visibly grown. It's much taller than it used to be. But like Jacob said, the walls are still collapsing. So, we'll see what happens. One of the things that surprises people a lot, if people ask, okay, well, Mount St. Helens went in 1980. What's the next volcano? What's most likely to be the next volcano that erupts? And the answer is still Mount St. Helens. It's actually, if you look at the activity of the Cascades volcanoes over geologic time, Mount St. Helens erupts like all the freaking time. So,
it does.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, the other volcanoes may well erupt as well. The next one could be something else. But if just from a probability perspective, Mount St. Helens is most likely to be the next one to have a major eruption again.
Well, let me ask you this then, just the opposite of that. Statistically, or if we're betting on volcano eruptions, what's the least likely one to go? Based on historical data. I mean, is that, if you can speculate that St. Helens is the most likely.
If you give
Mount
me
Adams.
Mount Adams. Yeah. Mount Adams.
Mm-hmm.
Mount Adams. Okay.
Because it's off axis.
It's what?
It's called off axis.
Off
so
axis.
if you've probably noticed that if you've ever looked at a map of the big peaks in Washington, that they all kind of line up. But Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams are a little weird. If you kind of draw a line down all the Cascades volcanoes, Mount St. Helens is a little bit to the west of the line, and Mount Adams is a little bit to the east of the line. And the line is there because that's when Jacob at the beginning of this talk was discussing how the ocean plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, is diving underneath the North American plate. Rather than thinking of plates like dinner plates, like round things, you can kind of think of them as slabs, like a big slab of clay or something. So if you take two, say, rectangular slabs and you sort of shove one underneath the other one, there's a line where they overlap. And when the downgoing plate kind of continues to go down into Earth's mantle, there is a bunch of stuff that happens that makes a lot more sense with the diagram. Basically, it causes that's where magma is formed, where rocks melt into molten rock, and that fuels volcanoes. And that those melt centers all happen in a line along the downgoing slab. And where the volcanoes are up above is where the rising magma pokes through to the surface. And so there's this sort of magma generating zone that forms in a line because of the geometry of plate tectonics, and then that rises in a line to create the volcanoes. But if you look at Mount St. Helens and if you look at Mount Adams, they are not in line. And interestingly, Mount St. Helens is super active, even though it's not in line, but Mount Adams is like really not active, and also not in line.
Well, could it be because it's further west? So is that closer to movement on those plates?
You have any thoughts, Jacob? I think it's.
So I'm totally speculating here.
As far as I understand, it's still an open question. Exactly why?
It is kind of an open question because, again, like you were saying, Leslie, like just the line that dictates where most of the Cascades volcanoes are. I'm just trying to visualize it in my head. Like it almost bisects a line between Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams. So why one is more active right now than the other is not an answer that I know.
I don't think it's an answer anybody knows.
Well, and there's a lot of things that we are not going to have answers to in this field.
That's what makes geology great.
There's always more to ask.
Yeah.
So as I'm flipping through here, we could talk for hours, which you guys don't have time for, and that's fine. People should check out the book and all that. But what I'm looking at, okay, where was this? I got to scroll back because I've been flipping. I got to ask who came up with this. I know it wasn't you guys. You're reporting on it. The sizes of basically pebbles and where was that? Help me out.
Sizes of sediment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
who came up with those sizes? Those seem odd to me.
So since people don't have the book in front of them yet, you haven't purchased it yet.
Right.
What you're referring to is that if you've ever heard words like pebble, sand, mud, boulder, in common terms, when people hear those, they kind of think of a particular kind of material, but those terms actually refer to specific sizes of particles of sediment. And this is Jacob's field of expertise, so I will let him go from there.
Yeah, I honestly don't know who originally came up with the size divisions and particular names, but it can be really, really helpful when you're observing either sediment that's in a pile on a beach, or sediment that's contained within a sedimentary rock that you're looking at, because the size of the sediment that's present and the size ranges of sediment present. Like if you have a sediment that's all one size or a huge range from really tiny particles to really big ones, that can tell you a lot about the history of that particular batch of sediment. So if you can imagine kind of the journey of a rock is like, imagine you're a rock up on top of, let's say, Glacier Peak, and you break off of Glacier Peak. Let's say it's basically there's a fracture between you and the main mountain. The fracture fills in with water. It freezes overnight and wedges off this giant chunk of rock. So you're going to start with a really, really big rock that probably has some very sharp, angular edges to it. But as that rock works its way downhill, so it's going to start rolling and bouncing downhill, it's also going to be rolling and bouncing against a bunch of other rocks. So it's going to break into smaller pieces as it travels further from its source. And also the sharp edges will get kind of worn down. And then eventually you might, as this piece of rock, end up in a river. And then if the river has enough water in it, it will transport that sediment further downstream. And as it gets transported farther and farther and farther, of course, it is constantly bouncing again and rolling and banging off other rocks. So it continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller and more round. Like the sharp edges basically get knocked off, kind of like a nature's rock tumbler, if you will, because that's pretty much what rock tumblers do. You take specimens, you put them in the rock tumbler, you let it spin for a few days, and it basically bounces off all the sharp edges on a rock and polishes it. So it's kind of the same thing. But it takes a much longer period of time. So if you're looking at a pile of sediment or sediments, again, in a sedimentary rock, you can kind of go for that. Like, okay, there are a bunch of pieces of sand-sized particles, so fairly small ones, but still you can pick them out with your eye or run your hand across it, and it feels like sandpaper. The sand must have been transported quite a ways from where it actually was first eroded off of a rock outcrop somewhere else. Or you can also have an outcrop where there are this huge range of different sizes of rocks that are all, say, angular in shape. So you have like tiny angular pieces and huge angular pieces. That probably is much closer to its source than the sand, because the rocks haven't had enough time basically to get worked. And it's a process called sorting. So we describe rocks or sets of sediment as being well sorted if they're all the same size, or poorly sorted if we have a huge range of sizes. And it kind of correlates with distance from where the sediment initially formed.
And this is actually really important for studying things like mountains that don't exist anymore. So when we think about mountains like the Cascades, we think, they're so big, they're so old, but actually they're really young. Like a lot of the Cascades peaks are less than 1 million years old. And there are older mountains, a lot of them much further to the east. Is everything okay? Everything's okay. Okay. Everything much further to the east that we can only study by studying the sediments that they eroded away into. So we're looking at mountains so old that they've been worn down by time, but we can still learn about them by looking at the particles that they sort of disintegrated into. In addition to learning about like the basins that they were in and all of the sort of sedimentary stuff, but I'm more of a big mountain person than a sediments person. So that's my bias.
Well, you just said something about mountain. I mean, I guess once again, very layman here. Very, very layman.
Mountains that don't exist anymore.
Mountains that don't exist anymore. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. So if you had to guess so this is my question back to you. If you had to guess at what the youngest rock in existence is, how old would you guess that rock is?
29. No, 200,000 years.
No. The youngest rock in existence is a rock that is being formed right now, this very second. The process.
Good question.
So the process of rock formation is ongoing all the time. If you remember third grade, you probably remember learning about igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic rocks, which are the three major rock types. Igneous rocks come from lava, sedimentary rocks come from sand and mud, metamorphic rocks come from rocks being buried deep underground and having a lot of heat and pressure. But once a rock is formed, it's not done being formed. And I mean, there are some rocks that have sort of formed once and basically have stayed the same for millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of years. But rocks form from other rocks. It's a process called the rock cycle. So igneous rocks form from lava and they cool, and then they get eroded into little particles and can become sedimentary rocks, and they can be buried and become metamorphic rocks, and then a metamorphic rock can melt and become an igneous rock, and so on and so forth. So the rocks are formed by recycling other rocks. So we often think of rocks as very eternal and unchanging, still and solid features, but they're on the scale of the history of the Earth. They're incredibly dynamic and they're changing constantly. And so the mountain ranges that we see around the world today are big and impressive, and many have very long histories about how they got there. But like the way that they look today, especially on the Cascades, is very recent. Speaking about Mount St. Helens, the thing that blows a lot of people's minds is that the current cone of Mount St. Helens, the part that really sticks out above the ground, is really only about 3,000 years old. So like it is younger than the pyramids in Egypt. And obviously it like blew a lot of its top off, right? And is, sort of in the process of growing back, but maybe it'll like blow itself up again. But even for mountains that don't blow themselves up, they get eroded away by wind and water and ice. And there are, in Washington, it's young enough that you don't have a lot of these like super ancient mountains that have kind of come up and gone away again. But a lot of the sedimentary rocks that make up Washington started out as rocks that were in mountains in Idaho and Montana and got transported via streams and things into Oregon and Washington. And so the history of these older mountains that predate the Rockies and the Sawtooths in what used to be the edge of North America before Washington got kind of squished on there, can be found in the eroded remains of those rocks that are currently hanging out in Washington and Oregon. And also there's Canadian history, because like Canada, geology doesn't care about political borders. So a lot of things from Canada.
Oh, come on. The show's only Washington.
A lot of things from Canada are washed down into Washington as well. Does that answer your question?
It does. It's thank you for sharing that, because it reminds me. So one of my earlier guests was a professor at Central Washington. His name is Nick Sentner. And he was, I don't know, Jacob, have you heard of Nick Sentner? Yeah. So how do I want to say this? Just a real quick story. He agreed to be on the show. He basically said, I sent him an email. He said, yes, let's set the time. We set the time. 30 seconds before the show records, he pops on my screen, just like you did, Jacob. That's my first, like seeing you today is the first time seeing you. I had no idea where we were going with this thing. So he goes off and he's telling his stories, and he's a great storyteller. Yes, and he mentions something about the enchantments and how that rock came from basically Baja. Mm-hmm. And I was like, huh? And he gives me, oh, you're paying attention. And he starts telling me this story. And I never thought about the movement of these things. I just always kind of assume they're static. I mean, they're mountains. They don't move. But that's completely wrong, because they do move. And you're elaborating on that story in a different way. And it's really quite fascinating to hear.
Yeah, it's probably one of the greatest things about geology is just wrapping your head around the immense scale of time that we're working with. I mean, there's some processes that you can observe happening over a split second. And then there's other processes that you'd have to sit down and, make sure you have like a couple pots of coffee for the next couple million years before you see any kind of change.
2 pots of coffee is not going to cut it for a million years. Sorry, there's just no way.
That's at least like 5.
Yeah, at least 5. At least 5. So to wrap this up, to respect your guys' time, I'm going to ask you both the same question. So why don't you give us, in your own words, a brief summary of the book and what it means to you?
Who goes first?
Whoever wishes to go first can go first.
Okay.
I'll wing it.
That's what this episode. Exactly that's what the show's always about. It's just winging.
Yeah. Basically, a good summary would be, if you're curious at all about geology or the natural world, and you live in the Pacific Northwest or Washington specifically, and you wonder the why and the how. Like, why is Washington a thing? Where did Washington come from? How did these rocks get to here? The book's a great kind of primer on geology. It's kind of like a geology 101 light, if you will, in terms of kind of introducing a bunch of the concepts. But then it goes beyond that. So if you find one little niche of geology that you're super interested in, say you get really excited about, I don't know, chain silicate minerals. You could definitely really dive into that.
About chain silicate minerals.
Yeah. So I guess what it means, is it's just a really, really good resource.
Okay.
I think, and not only just a resource, but if anyone's curious and wants to learn more about geology, especially with local geology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure.
Leslie?
So I mentioned at the beginning of the show that I kind of wrote this book in a way for me when I first came to the Northwest, a book that I wish existed. But it's also written for a lot of the people who would come to talk to me at the museum. So I spent hours of my life. People would make an appointment or they just show up and knock on my door and say, I found this rock. And what is it? What's this rock? And what's all about it? And so this book is a way for you, if you have ever wondered something like that, to learn how to figure out what's this rock that I'm holding, and why is it interesting? Why? I mean, it might be interesting to you just because it's beautiful or funny looking, or you found it in a place that has other stories attached to it for you. But rocks have their own stories and they tell their own stories. You can learn how to read them by learning how to recognize different features and components of your rock. And so this book is basically a way to show you how to see and read those features and start to understand how to tell those stories to yourself. And they happen at lots of different scales. They happen at the scale of mineral crystals. They happen at the scale of a rock. They happen at the scale of an outcrop on the side of the road, or a whole landscape, like those giant waterfalls we were talking about at the beginning. And all of those stories are interesting in and of themselves. Like Jacob said, if you're interested in single chain silicate minerals, or if you're interested in why is that volcano there, both of those.
I don't know why I said single chain silicate minerals. I was just trying to think of like some really specific thing.
That is a very specific thing. If you want to know what it is, buy the book. So learning how to look at geology at all of these different scales, you might find that your particular niche is at one or another of those scales, but you can kind of learn all about them and they all inform one another to get this bigger picture of what is the story. And so the way that the book is put together is it has a chapter on what is plate tectonics. It has a chapter on mineral identification, rock identification, a little thing about meteorites and fossils. It has a chapter on rock structures, so like how to tell if your rock has been pushed or pulled or whatever. It has a chapter on landscapes, so like why is there a river over here and a mountain over there. And then the last chapter is one that's called Telling the Story. And that's basically once you get really good at feature identification, like being able to say, that's a basalt, that's a sandstone, that's a cinder cone volcano, that's a, whatever. Then the telling the story of this section is about how over many decades, scientists have worked together to sort of piece these little puzzle pieces and clues together into a bigger story. And so you can kind of go back and forth between seeing the features, learning about the bigger story, and then once you know the story, knowing how to look for those features when you're out and about in the landscape. And it's a reference book. It's a field guide, so it's not something that you're meant to like sit down and read straight through, but it's something you're meant to be able to have with you. And so if you look at something and you're curious about it, you can use the resources in this book to figure out your way in so that you can learn more, sort of at your own level of interest and at your own pace. And there are also resources in it for, if you want to, if you're suddenly struck with the desire to become a geologist, like how to do that. If you, want to go out and collect rocks, how to find the people who can help you do that. And so it's supposed to be kind of a gateway drug into rocks is the idea.
Perfect. It's a gateway drug into rocks. We might lead this episode off with that soundbite. I have a hunch. Where will people be able to find the book?
Great question. You can buy it online wherever books are sold. No, for serious, you can buy it at like Target.com and Barnes & Noble and Amazon. I personally am a fan of indie bookstores. And so if you are not familiar with a website called IndieBound, INDIEbound.com, it helps you find bookstores that are local to you. And if they don't carry the book, you can order the book through that bookstore. And that's a way to help support your local beloved bookstore business, especially during these pandemic times when a lot of these smaller businesses are struggling because they lack foot traffic. But really, if you're like an Amazon Prime member and you want to get your free 2-day shipping, you can go that way too.
Okay. One last question for both of you. So the book's launched, so you've released it to the wild, so you're done. What's next? You gonna write another book?
Second edition.
Well, so it's interesting that you say that, because learning to get to a place with this book where we could say it was done, I felt like it's the kind of thing that you could keep working on forever, because there's always well, we could include this, we could go out and do a little more. Like there's so much in it, but there's so much more we could have talked about. And so getting to a point where it's like, okay, this is good for now. This is a good book for now. And everything else we'll put in a second book later. Okay. So
yeah, my spouse jokingly called it writing a second dissertation.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I have not asked you guys the normal questions that I normally ask of people, but so I'm going to ask you both two questions. Was there any spectacular failures in this book? In other words, you thought this would be really cool to do, and it just didn't work out with regards to this book. That's question number one. And question number two, in all your travels around Washington State, where was the best place you grabbed something to eat?
Well, for the failures, there were some circumstantial, like things related to circumstances. There were some trips that I wanted to take that ended up not being able to happen because of like life conspiring to get in the way. That's not really a failure, but it was disappointing. Sure. But I guess one of the things that I wish we'd had time to do more was put in more maps. Some people find maps like really confusing and daunting, but I love maps. I love maps so much. And this book only has 2 of them. But it turns out that doing a project on both Oregon and Washington, number one, is extremely ambitious in terms of the amount of material that you need to cover. And number two, getting the data for a lot of these things involves going through the state resources. So basically the state departments of geology and their maps and the information they have available. And both Oregon and Washington have those, but they focus on very different things and organize their data in very different ways. And so the process of trying to come up with cohesive data upon which to base maps across state lines in a way that was both accurate and made sense ended up being just too tough. It was something that I worked on quite a bit, and basically just got like lost in a sea of spreadsheets that never saw the light of day. It was very disappointing.
Yeah, I think when Leslie, when we were going back and forth after I'd kind of done one of, I think, 20 rough drafts of a geologic map of Oregon and Washington combined.
Yeah.
Just we kept running into that same problem over and over and over.
So
okay, that's
maybe the next project would be to make, because there's so much geology that crosses state lines, but like that encompasses the whole of the region. But because of this political boundary and this like way that politically we deal with our data, it's so hard to make them a cohesive whole. So maybe that's like the next great project is
the Oregon geologists are not funded to work in Washington, and the Washington geologists are not funded to work in Oregon.
Yeah.
Okay. So how about, so then part two, that is when you were out doing your research, where was a memorable meal? Where was a great place that you stumbled across? Liberty Coffee.
Liberty Coffee is my story, man. But the thing is, at least when I was out and about, usually you'd like pack a lunch and take it with you, right? But
see, no, just kidding.
So one of the things when you're with a bunch of geologists who are out on a field day, you can kind of get a little bit of like clout if whatever lunch you bring is like the least like a field lunch. So like if you bring a sandwich, that's very boring. If you bring like sushi you made that morning, that's very cool. So,
on dry ice, so that it's at perfect temperature.
Okay. I don't recall the names of any of them, but I've had some really, really good tacos at food trucks in Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Oh, I can't remember the name. There's a couple of them in Kashmir that are phenomenal.
Never been disappointed.
Fruit stands. Okay, I will say all of the fruit stands in like the Yakima and Chelan area, man, those were spot on fruit stands for me.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, thank you both for being on. This is enjoyable, and I'm looking forward to listening back to it when we get it edited. Right. And I wish you guys all the best with the book. I'm excited to pick up a copy for myself.
Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. Thank you much. This would be great.
All right.
Have a good one.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Join us next time for another episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast.